Welcome to the second day of the Philippines, Spain, Globalization, 16th century to the present. So, once again, thank you for being here. We'll be starting off today with panel 6B titled The State and Native Appropriations of Coloniality. So, the panel would like to recognize Dr. Norman Owen, Professor Emeritus of the University of Hong Kong. He is the author of the Principalia in Philippine History, Kabicolan, from 1790 to 1898, published in Philippine Studies, and of Life, Death, and the Sacraments in a 19th century Bicol parish, published in the volume Population and History, edited by Daniel Deppers and Peter Zenos. So, Dr. Norman Owen, would you like to introduce today's panel?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yes.
Oh, okay, excellent. All right. Good evening to all of you from North Carolina, which means it's good morning to those of you in the Philippines, and some kind of good day if there's anyone watching from anywhere else in the world. My name, as you will have gathered, is Norman Owen. I've been studying Philippine history since the 1960s, and I'm coming up on a half a century since my first publication on it, Compadre Colonialism, which was written and edited when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan a lifetime ago. I am honored to be asked to chair this panel, and I will also serve as first discussant once the papers have been presented. The official title of this panel is The State and Native Appropriations of Coloniality, which is not exactly incorrect, but did not seem to me to represent very clearly what we are doing here. Then I was reminded of a seminal book dating from 1959, John Leddy Phelan, The Hispanization of the Philippines, which has as its subtitle, Spanish Aims and Filipino Responses. That's it, I thought. And that's what we're talking about today, except we're inverting the order with the two papers on Filipino responses, actually preceding the two on Spanish aims. I am pleased to say that all four papers, which I have read, are solidly researched in primary sources as well as grounded in previous scholarship on their topics, and that all help us to challenge two oversimplifications that so often plague discussion of Philippine history. One is seeing colonialism, particularly that of Spain, as being monolithically bad, nothing but the exploitation of Asians by the West. The other is seeing Filipino responses as essentially binary, either open and complete resistance to colonialism, warfare, or retreat up to the hills as remontados, or else as capitulation, accepting total subordination to the conquistadores and the friars. Instead, these papers show us far more complicated Spanish aims, sometimes much more benevolent than is often acknowledged, and also more nuanced Filipino responses by individuals making the best of the fact that Spain was now ruler of most of the archipelago. I think of the latter as like people reacting to a great storm, a bagyo. Some people may simply try to ignore it. Some may flee to other locales. Some may board up whatever they can and hunker down until the bagyo passes. But no reasonable person says they should just resist the storm. If they don't, they are collaborating with it. History, as portrayed in these papers, was lived by real people who were constrained by their environment and tried to make the best of it. I try to think of them always as autonomous, if not always free, making up their own minds as to what to do or aim for in their unique situations. Since our sources for this period are overwhelmingly in Spanish, we have much more evidence of the words of Spaniards, whereas for Filipinos, we often have to deduce their intentions from their actions. But in either case, we remain conscious of real people making real choices in real time. Rather than slow down this process by stopping to introduce each paper, I'm going to step out for a bit after briefly introducing all four presenters in the order in which you will hear them, and then leave it to the moderator to shuffle them in and out. First, Dr. Grace Liza Y. Concepcion, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Asia and the Pacific, where she teaches undergraduate courses in Philippine history. Her dissertation is focused on the rise and development of pueblos in Laguna de Bay, a region outside Manila from the late 16th to the mid 18th century, and she is currently researching on property holding by natives in the Philippines in the 17th century. Second, Nicholas Michael Chow Si, also known as Hobie, an assistant professor in the Department of History, University of the Philippines, Diliman. He has published 2 articles in Philippine Studies, one on the municipal elites of San Pablo Laguna, the other on Horacio de la Costa. His research includes global history, the early Spanish Empire, demographic history, and the history of conversion. Third, we have Abisai Perez from Mexico, where he completed his BA and master's studies before starting his doctoral studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Bienvenido a Filipinas.
Thank you.
Filipinas virtual, I guess we would have to say. Currently, he's working on his dissertation, which explores how the Spanish crown integrated the native elites of the Philippines during the 16th and 17th century. And finally, we have Dr. Marlon James Salas, currently working as a postdoctoral fellow in critical translation studies, the Department of Comparative Literature of the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Also holds an honorary research affiliation at the Center for the Historiography of Linguistics at KU Leuven in Belgium. He wrote his PhD dissertation at Monash University in Australia on the Tagalog grammar of Fray Francisco Blancas de San Jose. He's a literary translator who has published 3 books to date. Those are the 4 speakers. That's the order you will hear them, and you will hear from me after they are all done. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Owen. And with that, let's start with our first speaker, Dr. Grace Concepcion.
Well, once again, good morning, everybody. And thank you and congratulations to the conference organizers for putting this event together. And thank you very much to Professor Owen for the very kind and insightful introduction to our panel, and for reading our papers and making suggestions for improvement. Now, the title of my paper is Brokering Governance and Security, the Native Elite's Political and Military Career. Okay, so the Gobernadorcillo is an unforgettable figure in Philippine colonial history. What is less known is that at times, gobernadorcillos were also appointed to military positions at the pueblo or provincial level. Using archival documents from the Archivo General de Indias, this paper will examine the career of the native elite of the Laguna province as they navigated the colonial structure. The study shows that the story of these elites opened a window to the colonial dynamics in the province and possibly the whole colony. Theoretically, this is my method and aim. Theoretically, the study is the beginning of an exercise that will delve into the interplay of microhistory and maybe global history, but I haven't reached the global history part, so I'll just be sharing the microhistory part. It was important for the Spaniards to ensure governance and security in the 17th century, a tumultuous period in the history of the Philippines and the Spanish Empire in the Pacific. The threats that assailed the fledgling colony were continuous. The Chinese, the Japanese, the Dutch, and the Moros practically left the Spaniards and their allies without respite. To ensure their presence in the Pacific region, the Spaniards enlisted the help of native elites, both in taking charge of establishing colonial structures in the pueblos and maintaining peace and security within the colony. The pueblos of Laguna have a long history of being governed by their own gobernadorcillos. From very early in the colonial period, there is evidence of natives already recognized as gobernadorcillos, although the title was not applied to them until later. They were referred to as Kapitan Basal or Bansal. The earliest records of these leaders can be found in the account of the 1599 meeting at Lumban, which was held upon the order of the Spanish king in 1597. Although the post-gobernadorcillo is the best known, there were other positions open to natives in the governance of towns. In the early part of the colonial period, 3 distinct posts open to natives were identifiable: that of the Gobernador de Naturales, the Teniente y Tenientes de Visita, and the Cabeza de Barangay. Later, in the 17th century, the number of posts that principales could occupy increased to this number. So you have here Apart from the teniente, there were additions like the jueces de cementeras or de palmas, the inspectors of fields, the sown fields, the constable, the treasurer, and the notary. And the cabezas de barangay remained as the chief of each barangay that belonged to the pueblo. The gobernadorcillos were in charge of the collection of tribute, distribution of bandalas, the goods, that is, the goods that each pueblo was assigned to sell to the government, the distribution of work among the natives, arrangement of polos and servicios, and they performed some judicial function as well. The gobernadorcillo was elected annually. Up to the mid 17th century, all adult males had the right to vote. That is before the Governor Sebastian Hurtado de Corcuera's reforms in 1642, which stipulated that 12 senior cabezas de barangay would nominate 3 candidates to the gobernadorcillo post between January 1 and February 28 each year. The Governor General chose one nominee for each town close to the capital. For the remote provinces, the Alcalde Mayor chose one in the towns in his jurisdiction. So the organogram of Pueblo governance is represented in this diagram with the cabezas de barangay below. This organogram was in use until the mid-19th century when the Spanish government reformed provincial and municipal governance. Since I was curious about these early local officials and I wanted to check if all the pueblos of Laguna had them, I went in search of them in different archival collections until I chanced upon the financial reports of the Real Hacienda, with the help of the archivist in charge of the Philippine collection in the Archivo General de Indias. Using the list of taxpayers in these financial reports from the 17th century, specifically from 1633, I found out that local officials paid a special tax or media anata annually. Now, it was a tax imposed on government officials or people who held military posts, usually assessed based on half a year's salary. From these lists, we could identify and even follow their career because each entry identifies the taxpayer, their provenance, their position, and what they were paying for. But how much these local officials were paid still remains a question, or if they were paid at all. The lists show that throughout the 17th century, the Spanish government counted on the Principalia to govern the towns and to keep them secure. The Spanish government did the latter by appointing locals to the native militia, which now brings me to the next topic. Okay. Few studies have been done on the involvement of Filipino natives in the military, except for those that focused on the Pampangos, who fought for the Spaniards. Nonetheless, it is known that groups of Tagalogs were likewise recruited to help the Spaniards in their wars. These native soldiers were drafted from the pueblos to occupy military posts at town or provincial level. The native companies of soldiers in the Laguna region were militias organized to defend the province from external threats. Each pueblo had one or more than one Compañía de Infantería de Naturales, or native company, headed by a capitan, who was a member of the Principalia. What's less known is that at some point in their career, these native capitans also served as local pueblo officials. In the record of the Sangley Uprising in 1603, Governor General Pedro de Acuña ordered the establishment of infantry captaincies among the natives, quote, particularly in the provinces of Pampanga, Bulacan, Laguna de Bay, Tondo, Bombon, and Calilaya. The account of the Chinese uprising related that, quote, the governor sent out his Sargento Mayor, Don Juan de Arceo, with 200 infantrymen, 8 cavalrymen, 100 Pampangos, and 400 Tagal Indians, all with firearms and 2 pieces of cannons, end quote. In the 1639 Sangley Uprising, Governor Sebastian Hurtado de Corcuera reported that 3,000 Tagalogs and 1,000 Pampangos were enlisted to help 200 Spaniards suppress the insurrection. Like the principales who were appointed civil posts, natives who assumed posts in the militia also paid their medianata. From the payment entries and the amount they paid, I made a list of posts they occupied, arranged according to superiority. So you have here the posts at provincial level and the pueblo level. What we see here are parallel structures, one at the pueblo level and the other at a more all-encompassing provincial level. The pueblo militia posts were occupied by natives of the pueblo itself, while the posts in the provincial militia were held by natives drafted from different pueblos. The maestre de campo of the province was the highest position that natives could hold. Some native maestre de campos even received encomiendas, while some also held civil posts. In the Spanish army, the maestre de campo was a high official in command of the tercio or regiments made up of 3,000 men. The tercio became an efficient fighting machine in 17th century Spain, in charge of ensuring the security of the peninsula. It seems that the Spaniards wanted to export this structure to their Pacific outposts as well. Here's an organogram depicting the structure of the Spanish army in the peninsula in the 17th century. We can see some similar posts also existed in the native militia. I've marked the posts that are similar to the ones that existed in the native militia, at least based on the entries of the accounts of the Royal Hacienda. So you have here the ayudantes, native militias divided into companies. There were capitans, alferes, and sargento. Okay. So who were these maestres de campo of Laguna? Well, I've identified several of them, but I'll focus only on a few because there's better documentation for these few. So you have here Ventura Mendoza, Juan de Mendoza from Mahayhay, Francisco Macapuli, Nagcarlan, Agustin de Villegas, probably Lumban, Lopez from Lumban, Don Juan Pili from Pililla. All of these are in the eastern side of Laguna. Now, I'm not able to estimate the period in which the maestres de campo held their post based on the records given. The maestre de campo, well, as we already mentioned, the maestre de campo was a prestigious post. And during the revolt led by Juan de la Cruz Palaris in 18th century Pampanga, a bit later, one of the demands that the people of Binalatongan made of the government was that, quote, the baton of master of camp of the province not be withdrawn from the pueblo of Binalatongan, end quote. We are still unsure as to how the baton of the maestre de campo was assigned in Laguna. At present, we know that the post was worth 30 pesos of media anata. If the maestre de campo paid that media anata every year, he must have been wealthy. Now, 3 of these maestres de campo on the list held civil posts and were even granted encomiendas by the Spanish government. Now, looking at the places of origin of these maestres de campo makes me ask why the baton of the master of camp seemed to remain predominantly in Lumban. Look here, Lumban. So made me, and even Juan de Maculangan stayed on as maestre de campo for several years. Now, so it made me ask what was in Lumban. Here is a map of Lumban. It's located in that part of Laguna that is less urbanized than the western side. A clue to, well, nowadays, 21st century. A clue to Lumban's significance comes from the fact that the 1599 meeting of native leaders ordered by Philip II was held there. And in 1600 or 1601, the first event outside Manila that honored the Holy Eucharist was held there. So there was a procession of the Holy Eucharist gathered many people from the different towns of Laguna, and they all converged in Lumban. In this paper, I will not address the questions on provincial dynamics. Rather, I want to focus on the careers of these native elites. But those are just questions that maybe require some answering a little later. Now, okay, so let's go to Don Ventura de Mendoza and Don Juan de Mendoza. They were a father and son team. Don Ventura was among those who helped the Spaniards crush the Sangley uprising of 1603. After the event, lawyer of the Audiencia, Hernando Rios Coronel, asked the king to recognize two native principales, Don Guillermo of Pampanga and Don Ventura of Laguna de Bay. And it said, during the time of the War of the Sanglays, when the native Yndios from around Manila and Laguna de Bay, and especially the province of Pampanga, rose up and fought very well against the Sanglays, and they faithfully and gladly helped us. And if they allied themselves with the enemies, it would have been the end of the Philippines. May your highness order the governor in your highness's name. They should be thanked, which would greatly please them, and especially some principales like Don Guillermo, who was maestro de campo of the Indios of Pampanga on that occasion, and Don Ventura, who was that of the Indios of Laguna de Bay. And may it be ordered that the religious who are in charge of doctrinas treat them well, since they usually restrict them over light matters. In 1620, the governor granted Don Ventura an encomienda of 300 tributes of Christian and pagan negrillos who lived in the mountains of Mahayhay. Luciano Santiago recounted that Don Juan de Mendoza, Ventura's son, inherited his father's encomienda when his father passed away in 1628. Don Juan was likewise appointed maestro de campo. By that time, there were less tributes. There is a record in the Real Hacienda that accounts Real Hacienda of 1634 of Don Juan de Mendoza's payment of media annata for some tributes of negrillos of Laguna. Santiago speculated that Don Juan de Mendoza's sons, Francisco and Ventura II, must have inherited his encomienda. So I just made the diagram of Don Ventura de Mendoza's career. So you see here that he was Gobernadorcillo of Mahayhay from 1600 1610, Maestro de Campo of Laguna from 1603, sorry, not 1604, and then encomienda of 40 negrillos. Okay, now, and here's another native elite who held a civil post, probably an inspector of fields, not as prestigious as Gobernadorcillo, but later on he became Maestre de Campo, honor before 1646, and he also held encomiendas. Okay, and now I move on to the last of the native elite. The best documented among the Maestres de Campo is Juan de Maculangan of Lumban. He held various civil and military posts. He was Gobernadorcillo from 1654 and Maestre de Campo from 1660. So here's a table listing all his posts. Maestre de Campo, 1660, 1687, Maestre de Campo, 1694, etc. And then here are his encomiendas. Okay. He was still Maestro de Campo in 1687 before he assumed Don Agustin de Villegas' encomienda. He already held another of 30 whole tributes of Indios Bagamundos. He paid 60 pesos for the 6-year exemption from the labor and personal services of those tributes. He paid media annata for the whole duration of the time he held these encomiendas. 9 years later, in 1687, Di Maculangan received the encomienda which remained vacant upon the death of his predecessor, Maestro de Campo, Don Agustin de Villegas. Di Maculangan still had that encomienda in 1690 because he again paid the 10 peso media annata for the second year of his encomienda of negrillos. But in 1700, the same Di Maculangan requested yet another privilege from the government. At least there's evidence that his letter with his hoja de servicio was processed in the Consejo de Indias before June 6, 1700. Okay. According to the document, Di Maculangan served as Sargento Mayor, Maestro de Campo, and Maestro de Campo General at different times. He accompanied the Spaniards in the siege in the hills of Malaya against the Cimarrones in 1650. He also fought against Sanglays and the battle against Gosinga in 1662. Aside from his military service, he also served in civil posts as governor of Lumban in different years. He was also Cabo de Cortes de Madera, in charge of the men drafted to fell trees used for shipbuilding.
Okay.
Aside from requesting
Sorry, excuse me, Dr. Grace, you have over 3 minutes. Oh, you have about 3 minutes left. Please wrap up. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm wrapping up. Aside from requesting tribute exemption from his wife and relatives, he requested for the first encomienda that would be vacant. That was in 1700. However, there's no evidence that he actually took over an encomienda in the 18th century. Now, some preliminary conclusions. The cases of these native elites were not unique, as there were many more principales who shifted from one post to another and found niches for them within the colonial structure. The principales of their respective pueblos held civil and military posts in the Spanish era pueblos at some point in their lives. They helped the Spaniards in their battles and received encomiendas, some of them, so that they could gather the scattered people in the mountains and get them to live like the others in the pueblos. As the pueblos became well entrenched in the 17th century, they also became points of reference for transactions between the Spanish government and the people of Laguna. And the principales became brokers of these colonial transactions by taking charge of monitoring and protecting the security, not just of their pueblos, but also of the province, and thus ensure the continuation of the Spanish project in the Pacific. Thank you very much and stay safe, all of you.
So first, I'd like to thank Dr. Owen for chairing our panel and for reading each of our papers. So good morning. Here are my two titles. I had to change course midstream. So originally, I was interested in the elite's transformation from autonomous datus to imperial allies, and then that transformation during the early colonial period, and then the transformation from imperial allies to a bureaucracy servants in the late colonial period. I wanted to know if I could map that transition. Unfortunately, the answer for now is no. But in the process of running my data, I did spot a pattern which I'd like to discuss today. And I've adjusted my research question to account for it. For this paper, I look at the parallel transformation discussed by the literature, which says that over time, indigenous elites consolidated political power at the local level. They also used colonial tools to do so, such as tactical marriages, spiritual kinship, resettlements, laws of property, and laws of inheritance. While there is some dispute as to whether political consolidation was interrupted during the 19th century, for that early period from A to D, the literature generally describes increasing consolidation. Now, I argue that that consolidation increased more slowly and more late than we think. While I'm answering a concern similar to the one addressed by the literature, due to the limitations of my data, I use a different approach. Whereas the literature talks about the 19th century, I work in the 17th. The literature is interested in families consolidating power, but I work on individuals. The literature is interested in village and municipal leaders. I focus on the municipal leaders. So I ask, did 17th century indigenous leaders, as individuals, perpetuate themselves in office? If yes, why? If no, why not? And I asked that question for one case study, the municipality of San Pablo in Laguna, 1636 to 1700. Now, my main data sets for answering that question are two. The first is the baptismal register, which I have thanks to the help of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and especially Mr. Pelvier Ordinario. This is a record of all baptisms in a given community per day, collected across centuries. Every entry on this register has the following data, and we are most interested in numbers 2 and 3. My second data set is the Media Anata, which I have from the Archivo General de Yndios in Seville, thanks to a different project spearheaded by Dr. Maria Serena Diokno. In the 1630s, the King of Spain began to charge people for a variety of government grants, including the acquisition of municipal offices. These entries were recorded per year, and from what I've seen, payments were taken for about a century and a half. We are most interested in numbers 1, 3, and 4. In this presentation, first, I describe San Pablo's integration into the empire. Second, I describe my roster of municipal officials during that period. Third, I say that 13 names repeated themselves often, which hints at the consolidation of power. But then I cautioned that only 7 of these names actually can be linked to distinct individuals. And I showed that these 7 people held offices only sporadically. Fourth, I explained why. So this is the Philippines. And San Pablo is in upland Laguna between 3 mountains, Makiling, Malarayat, and Banahaw. In the 17th century, the pueblo also included all of what is today an independent town, Alaminos. There are conflicting stories as to how San Pablo entered the Spanish Empire in 1571. In both stories, the conquistador Juan de Salcedo and his subordinates meet 4 warring Gats, Gat Pangil, Gat Pulintan, Gat Sungayan, and Gat Salakab, who live in this area. In one version, the Gats resist the Spaniards and they're replaced. In another version, they convert and their paramount leader becomes municipal mayor. Whichever version you choose, the 4 warring communities are joined into one, with one set of municipal leaders. And these were their municipal leaders in the 1600s. It's 367 entries, so I only show snippets of the roster here. I compiled this list from 3 sources. The first is a transcription from my co-panelist, Dr. Concepcion, based on the Laguna Media Anata. The second is my own collection of colony-wide Media Anata. And the third is Juan Hernandez's list of gobernadorcillos based on local sources. And there are a few caveats I need to make here. Perhaps we can discuss them later. But for now, let's move on. So on this chart, you see how many names held how many offices. For example, there were 44 names that each showed up 2 times okay, so that's the second row there. In total, only 248 names held these 367 offices. Our target is to find distinct people among them and not just the names that appear multiple times. The majority of people held municipal positions for just 1 term, just 1 year, in other words, since these were annual positions. Only the 13 names on the left can be linked to distinct individuals. Okay, only the 13 names on the left show up in 4 or more terms of any office. Okay. But not all these names should be considered distinct individuals. On this chart on the right, you see baptismal names and how often they were given based on the period's baptismal register. The name Juan de la Cruz was given 39 times across 2,129 cases. Some of these names on my list of 13 on the left are such common names that they were likely shared by multiple office holders. So I'm crossing them out. On this chart, you see each name and the interval between the first year they held office and the last year that they held office. For some names, that range is much too long. In the 1800s, the average male lifespan in the next door town of Nagcarlan was 53 years old. Assuming that for our period it was similar, we need to eliminate a few more names. So like Diego Pato, for instance, is not likely to have been active that long. The name was likely held by more than one office holder. So let's focus on the names that do qualify. The positions available are in purple, and Grace has described a little bit what these positions are about. The gobernador was the municipal mayor. The tenientes were his right-hand men. The Juez de Cementeras and Juez de Palmas were inspectors of the fields and the palm trees. The mayordomo managed communal resources, such as the pueblo's lands and its treasury. And the alguaciles were in charge of public security. Finally, the scribes, there at the bottom, the scribes, the escribanos were scribes. So what I've done is I've charted each person's term of office over time. So Pedro Landecho, for instance, that fellow in the first row there, he was gobernadorcillo in 1663 and in 1670. So I have to make one caveat. I don't know what happens during the years in gray, the columns in gray over there. No media anata is paid, but if Juan Hernandez's list is to be believed, new people are still taking office during these times. So for now, I just assume that the pattern found in general was replicated in those years in gray. The pattern I see is that there were actually very few people who held multiple terms of office, and even those people held these terms non-consecutively. So it doesn't seem to look like effective consolidation. Yet for other times and other places, political leadership has proven to be desirable. For example, one account in Ilocos in 1743 describes people buying votes and flying in voters to get the post of Gobernadorcillo. One case from Bawan in Batangas in 1838 highlights one politician's ambitions. So what made 17th century San Pablo any different? And in explaining this pattern, one more caveat, I don't know how the Gobernadorcillo's subordinates attained office. See, the Media Anata says they were elected. It says electos. But it doesn't say by who. The Gobernadorcillo during this period was voted in by all adult male principalia. It's not clear if the same rule applied to everyone else. For now, I don't speculate. And to be honest, in terms of explaining the pattern I found, I'm still grasping at straws here. The explanation for the pattern that I do hypothesize comes from a religious investigation. It takes place in next door Santo Tomas in the 1680s. Essentially, the investigation discovers continuing animism. It accuses the parish priest of being negligent. The priest, they said, was more interested in cattle than catechism. Because of his neglect, people fled town to avoid colonial obligations. The most important among these obligations was the Cortes de Maderas. And this was when people were rounded up to go into the forest to chop wood and then drag it to the shipyard to build the king's ships. And according to the former mayor of Santo Tomas, this task could last up to 10 months. Now, during this religious investigation, San Pablo was implicated. Its priests had until recently also been raising cattle for sale in Manila. And the investigation found animism here in 3 of its barrios, San Cristobal, Bulaco, and Palakpakin, and Bulaco even had its own priestess. It's implied that San Pablo's Agustinian priests were similarly negligent. Now, this veiled accusation is supported by my data from the baptismal registers. The historian Bruce Cruikshank suggests that high levels of illegitimacy when found in the baptismal registers is one indicator of a priest's ineffectiveness. Meanwhile, both 17th century missionaries and modern historical demographers agree that the interval between the time a child is born and when it is baptized speaks about the quality of the record as a register of actual births, of total births. One Dominican in Zambales in the 1680s complained that his predecessor was never around, leading to many children being baptized too many days after birth. So let's look at our figures. Looking at illegitimacy, Cruikshank for 1842 in Franciscan areas in the Tayabas province and Bicol region, he says that 16% is too high. In San Pablo, San Pablo in the period we're studying had 19%. In other words, about 1 in 5 children were born to unwed parents. Let's look at the interval now between baptism and birth. Now, in the future, I will need to use the Zambales baptismal register to get a sense of what the Dominican I mentioned considered too many days. For now, as our benchmark, let's use San Pablo's baptisms in the 1800s. In the 1 year from August of 1853 to the end of July 1854, the average interval was 3 days. 89% of cases were done within 4 days, and the longest delay was 6 days. But in 1679, San Pablo's average interval was 18. Only one case was within 4 days, and 13 were delayed by 1 month or longer. In 1699, the situation improves a little bit. It was 14 days, which is one case within 4 days. In summary, looking at my header, I suspect that poor registers hinted at a negligent priest. A negligent priest meant inadequate support for Indio leaders when their followers were fleeing colonial obligations. And remember that these leaders were held responsible by the crown when their communities refused to comply with obligations. Okay, there's a lot going on in this slide, but you remember our subjects on the left and the timeline there at the bottom. And my research question is on the right. I suspect that San Pablo's 17th century leaders did not stay long in office because they had been asked to combine 4 warring communities into one and then to extract labor from that new community. And they were being asked to do so without the help of the colonial order's main agent, the parish priest. On the ratio of cost to benefits, costs to me seem to have weighed very heavily. So returning to our timeline on consolidation of power by the elites, it seems that for this one case study, entrenchment took place slowly, and if it did, it must have taken place later on. My findings are provisional. My study is ongoing. I continue to clean my data and to look for San Pablo sources. There are so many more questions to ask, like how did lower ranked officers attain posts? Are my findings true for other times and places? Did leaders even want to hold positions for more than once in their lives? And as Abisai pointed out to me, could they even afford it? If your primary interest is in families consolidating power, I know my findings don't contribute much. However, if your interest is in early colonial individuals, their ambitions and their realities, hopefully my findings at least make these follow-up questions a little more interesting. And so these are my references. And there. And I want to thank the following people, again, our chairman, the people here who helped me encode my data and to rehearse the presentation, and to the listeners. And your comments are very welcome. They would help me to improve my paper. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's begin. Dear listeners, good evening from Mexico. I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present my work. I also want to thank Dr. Norman Owen for reading and making comments to our research papers. One of my dissertation's main objectives is to trace how the Spanish crown integrated native Filipinos as vassals. Originally, my hypothesis was that the Spanish legislation to assert indigenous rights in colonial Mexico was forward with minimum changes in the Philippines. That's why the title of my presentation. Yet, after reviewing my research findings and writing my paper, I have identified that 4 regional and global processes conditioned the Spanish strategy to recognize the Philippine indigenous elites as sovereign rulers or principales, and to grant them a certain level of self-government. Now, my presentation aims to explain how the Spanish crown incorporated Philippine natives by analyzing how the global and regional processes that unfolded in the Spanish monarchy during the 16th century shaped the conquest and colonization of the archipelago. These processes were 4: the intellectual climate, the production of law, the reform of the imperial government, and imperial competition in Southeast Asia. A first key aspect was the intellectual climate in Spain. I specifically refer to the ideas of the School of Salamanca, which prompted the Spanish kings to legislate in favor of indigenous subjects. As historiography has explained, the School of Salamanca refers to a group of Spanish theologians and the ideas they developed about natural law during the first half of the 16th century. Particularly, Dominican thinkers Francisco de Vitoria and Bartolomé de las Casas stood out for developing the theory of the wretched Indian, which claimed that indigenous peoples were miserables, wretched, and that Spaniards had them illegally deprived of their freedom and lands. To compensate the natives for the dispossession and violence, both pro-Indigenous scholars encouraged the Crown to create a set of laws and institutions to guarantee them justice and protection. In response to the criticism, the Crown endorsed in 1556 a new approach of colonial expansion called pacification. On that year, Emperor Charles V forwarded the Viceroy of Peru a set of instructions to conduct new colonial enterprises following a strategy of pacification, which consists of in conquest through pacts of friendship and vassalage, and recognize native rulers as the original owners of the land inhabited. Since then, the pacification influenced subsequent colonial enterprise, including the conquest of the Philippines. The instructions that Miguel López de Legazpi received from the Real Audiencia of Mexico to conduct the Philippine expedition reveal that the Crown planned to integrate Philippine natives following the pacification strategy. Legazpi's instructions stated that the expedition's main objective was to bring the natives of those parts to the knowledge of our Holy Catholic faith and to discover their return navigation to this new Spain. To accomplish the goal, Legazpi had to take and settle with the natives all good friendship, showing the principales the king's goodwill. As a skilled notary, Legazpi always claimed to comply with the legal principles of the pacification instructions. The expedition reached the Philippines in early April 1565, and by the end of that month, it arrived at the city port of Cebu, whose subjugation Legazpi depicted as a voluntary pact of friendship. Initially, Tupas, Lord of Cebu, fiercely repelled the invaders when he realized they came to settle permanently. In one of those skirmishes, Spaniards captured 2 women and 2 principales ladies, whom he would release when Cebu's people accepted to become vassals of the King of Castile. The native chief ceded. After seeing that the captive women were unharmed, he accepted to become friend of the Spanish king and, in consequence, his vassal. A similar episode unfolds 6 years later in Manila. After a fierce violent encounter between the Spaniards and the people of Manila, in May 1571, Legazpi personally commanded a new expedition. He met the rulers of Manila and the native chief of the nearby town of Tondo. They performed the Protocol of Pacification, a legal document that sustained the incorporation of Manila's inhabitants as vassals of the Spanish crown. 3 legal principles validated the compact. The first principle referred to the voluntary election of a new sovereign. According to the document, Manila's principales assembled with other native lords to discuss whether it would be good for them to make peace and friendship with the Spaniards and be His Majesty's vassals. They then agreed that, with common consent, they wanted to be vassals of the King of Castile. Second, the protocol emphasized the providential mission that justified the Philippine expedition. Legazpi explained that he came to these villages by command of His Majesty the King of Castile, Don Felipe, who wanted to make them know the true Almighty God. Finally, the protocol guaranteed principales king's protection as a result of the vassalage compact. The Spanish captain explained that if any Spaniard or any other person in his company do any harm to them or take anything from them by force and against their will, he will act on behalf of the king as judge to maintain peace and justice as vassals of His Majesty. Ultimately, to become friend of the Spanish king meant to become his vassal. Vassalage was a contractual relation stemmed from a pact between a lord and a free man who voluntarily accepted to be and serve the lord in exchange for his protection. In the case of indigenous vassalage, the king recognized the status of native principales and promised them to respect their privileges and to protect them, while they committed to loyally serve their new lord. However, the promise quickly evaporated when Legazpi died just a year later. His sudden death left a power vacuum that allowed the exploitation and dispossession of the Philippine natives. Conquistador Guido de Labesaris, who succeeded Legazpi as governor, benefited his closest friends with encomiendas, indigenous labor drafts granted to Spanish conquistadors. Missionary Martin de Rada informed that many communities were killed by weapons of the conquistadors, who often took wherever they found in the towns. In de Rada's opinion, the encomenderos had become the de facto lords of the Philippines, and rather than vassals, Philippine natives had been turned into slaves. During the 1560s, while the conquest of the Philippines unfolded, the administration of the Spanish Empire experienced critical transformations. In 1567, facing the bankruptcy of the empire, King Philip II commissioned jurist Juan de Obando to reform the Council of Yndios, the highest institution for the colonial government. In doing so, Obando realized that one of the issues that required an urgent solution was the growing discontent of the encomenderos. They rejected the new laws, mainly because they prohibited the perpetual inheritance of the encomiendas and undermined their power to control indigenous peoples. To tame the rebellious encomenderos and avoid the emergence of a class of feudal lords in the overseas dominions, Juan de Obando grasped the creation of an institution known as the República de Yndios. It would reduce the influence of encomenderos over the indigenous vassals while guaranteeing them royal protection. The concept of República de Yndios referred to a political community endowed with institutional and authorities to govern itself and to ensure justice to its members. Such was the objective of the authorities appointed under Obando's administration as president of the Council of Yndios. They pursued the creation of the República de Yndios by stripping the encomenderos of their jurisdiction over natives and enforcing a compulsory resettlement of indigenous communities to grant them self-government under indigenous leadership. In this way, the crown would centralize the labor and tribute of its indigenous vassals while providing them with political autonomy. While the conquest of the Philippines was carried out through the logic of pacification, Obando's reformist project shaped its early colonization. To accomplish Obando's objectives in the Philippines, the king appointed Francisco de Sande as governor, and he, on his arrival at Manila, aimed to grant justice to indigenous vassals. The king ordered him to inspect the care that Spaniards have taken in the conversion of the natives and whether they made them any grievance. However, a year later, the crown reversed the decree because of its growing interest in the conquest of China. Sande last 5 years as governor, devoting all his energy to military conquest. He invaded Brunei, attacked the sultanates of Mindanao and Jolo, and tried to convince the Spanish king to invade China. A new governor arrived in Manila in 1580. The crown appointed Gonzalo Ronquillo as governor for life with the power to choose his successor in exchange for the recruitment and maintenance of 600 soldiers. The new governor would grant them encomiendas at the prejudice of natives. With such an appointment, the crown encouraged military expansion in Southeast Asia with the support of the encomenderos. Yet, since the governor was tasked with overseeing imperial expansion, the crown entrusted the protection of its indigenous vassals to their religious authority. After getting papal permission to create the bishopric of Manila in 1579, Philip II appointed Dominican friar Domingo de Salazar as the first bishop of the islands. He was a prominent student of the University of Salamanca and a follower of the pro-Indigenous thought of Vitoria and Las Casas. Soon after arriving in Manila, in 1582, Domingo de Salazar celebrated a synod, or church council, that gathered all the secular and religious authorities of the Philippines to defend the natives. The major concern that led the bishop to summon the synod was that the alcaldes mayores, Spanish officials in charge of tribute collection and providing local justice, were also encomenderos. They often prevent the natives from receiving a proper religious education and did not recognize them as vassals of the king. Through the Synod of Manila, Salazar expected to set norms of behavior to improve the treatment of natives and vindicate the status of Philippine principalities. In the Synod of Manila, Salazar drew two radical conclusions. First, Spanish conquistadors had conducted military campaigns without respecting the pacts of friendship and vassalage as the pacification instructions stated. Therefore, all the goods they took from the natives should be restituted by investing in the construction of churches for the missionary enterprise, since the Spanish dominion's primary purpose was that of Christian conversion. If the governor and the officials did not comply with such restitution, Salazar would denounce that the conquest of the Philippines was illegal. Second, Salazar suggests that Spaniards caused the Indians a great injury by thinking that they are not capable of governing themselves because Spaniards neither understand them nor know their language and their customs. Bishop Salazar went even further, saying that if the Spaniards understood indigenous peoples, we would see that they could govern themselves as well as we do, and that perhaps we are more barbaric to them than they are to us. In denouncing the barbaric ways in which Spaniards treated the natives, Salazar argued in favor of respecting the self-government of Philippine peoples and their customs. He proposed to empower principales as local judges. Salazar urged the governor to appoint Indian judges elected by the Indians themselves in the more populated villages, so that native subjects could ask for common justice and policia and ordinary cases before their own authorities. A good judge, Salazar said, and governor needed to possess a knowledge of his republica and its laws, customs, and abuse. Thus, Salazar concluded, the governor should, under mortal sin, put these Indian judges as a form to restitute all the injustices that Spaniards had brought upon indigenous peoples. The Synod of Manila of 1582 allowed Domingo de Salazar to propose the crown to endorse indigenous self-government in the Philippines, like it already exists in Spanish America. By empowering Philippine principales as judges, the crown would provide native peoples an administration of justice according to their own local customs, while granting them political autonomy beyond the influence of the encomenderos. As expected, Domingo de Salazar's project was met by strong opposition. Even though the bishop's ideas reached the Council of Yndios, imperial affairs remained the top priority of the Spanish government of the Philippines. Since 1582, the union of the crowns of Castile and Portugal under Philip II led to a military collaboration between the Spaniards and Portuguese against the Dutch. The plans to conquer China and the Muslim sultanates suddenly lost importance on the political agenda. Now it was more urgent to stop the Dutch challenge. The inquiries into the situation of the Philippine natives were thus delayed until 1589, when Juan de Plasencia, a Dominican fellow of Bishop Salazar, provided a critical insight. That year, Plasencia handed the Real Audiencia two works, Costumbres Antiguas de los Naturales de estas Islas and Costumbres de los Naturales de la Provincia de Pampanga, in which he described the most important aspects of the government, justice, inheritances, slaves, and endowments according to the traditions and customs of the Tagalog and Pampangos. The main purpose of both works was to inform about the ancient ways of justice of native peoples. Native commoners, Plasencia described, presented their lawsuits to the principal, who sought to reconcile the opposing parties through oral trials with the participation of witnesses. Plasencia inquiries showed that the Tagalog and Pampanga communities possess customs in which the principales play a central role in the exercise of justice, thus supporting Bishop Salazar's project of empowering the principales as local judges. 5 years passed before the crown recognizes the jurisdiction of Philippine principales and indigenous customs. In 1592, Governor Gomez Perez das Mariñas approved the first ordenanzas to protect the native peoples. The ordenanzas or local laws contain several ideas proposed by Salazar. The final and decisive steps that legitimized the principales and the indigenous customary law came a couple of years later. In 1594, King Philip II declared that, having been informed that the Indios principales were deprived of the señorío, dominion, they had in their gentility, Spanish authorities must provide the datus good treatment, thus restoring their government, as they had enjoyed in times of their gentility. In doing
Okay.
so, okay,
Oh, sorry. Excuse me, Abisai. You have 3 minutes to wrap up.
okay, perfect. In doing so, the royal cedula recognized status as legitimate governors of their barangays and hence guarantors of ordinary justice. A year later, the crown instructed the formation of a second audiencia, specifying now that all the native lawsuits must be summarily determined, keeping their habits and customs as long as they were not clearly unjust. In endorsing the principales, the barangay, and local customs as the keystones of local government, the Crown finally had established indigenous jurisdiction in the Philippines. Local communities will acquire limited self-government under the leadership of the native elites to escape from encomenderos hegemony. In sum, the Spanish Crown pursued in the Philippines the same strategy previously implemented in the New World, to recognize indigenous elite and their customs as legitimate and to grant them political autonomy. In taking a global approach, I consider that the incorporation and endorsement of the principales and the barangay in the Philippines follow three conjunctures. First, the conquest and the strategy of pacification. Second, the early colonial administration in line with Juan de Obandos's reforms against the encomenderos. And third, the incorporation of indigenous customary law. Before I finish my presentation, I would like to suggest a fourth process, the thought challenge. John Phelan's classic work grasped that the maintenance of the pre-Hispanic institutions of government aimed to secure Spanish colonization amid imperial warfare. By analyzing the early colonial Philippines in relation to the wide transformations of the Spanish monarchy, my research has built on Phelan's assertion. When Spanish dreams of imperial conquest in Asia collided with the bitter reality of the Dutch menace, Manila's authorities empowered principales to get their support. As leaders of the barangay, the capstone of pre-Hispanic social organization in Luzon, principales were the only ones capable of providing the resource to confront Spain's enemies. Was it the war against the Dutch that led the Spanish crown to finally grant autonomy to Philippine principales? Further research could prove that. Thank you so much.
Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat dyan sa Pilipinas. I start by thanking the organizers of this conference, my co-panel members, and Professor Norman Owen for their enthusiasm and commitment to see this conference through. Despite the obvious limitations posed by the pandemic. The paper I am presenting today is the product of my overlapping research commitments in translation studies, teaching Spanish as a foreign language, and Philippine missionary linguistics. I am currently engaged in a couple of research projects about the history of language and multilingualism in the Philippines, in the Spanish Philippines, focusing specifically on how translinguistic operations contributed to the production, circulation, and reception of linguistic knowledge. In doing this research, I realized that one of the most recurrent images of Spanish colonial rule in the Filipino popular imaginary is that it was a period of control, suppression, or decline of language-oriented activities. Memories from when I was attending high school in Maykawayan in Bulacan came to mind, specifically that story about the women from the neighboring town of Malolos. In what was perhaps the best-known case of language teaching in the Spanish Philippines, a group of middle-class Malolos women forwarded a petition in 1888 to the then Governor-General of the islands, Valeriano Weyler, to ask that evening classes in Spanish be organized for them. Their petition was denied at first upon the insistence of the curate of Malolos, but was eventually granted when a new priest took over the parish. Spain's alleged hostility towards languages became even more recurrent during the American period. Some writers, like William McKinley, allege that Philippine languages didn't flourish under the Spaniards, while others, like John Foreman, maintain that Spain refused to teach Spanish to the Filipinos. It seems to me that these suggestions do not add up. For how could Spain stifle the spread of Spanish while at the same time impeding the development of Philippine languages? I think either one of these claims should make the other invalid or fanciful at the very least. In fact, if we revisit the available archival documentation, we shall see that Spain did come up with measures to promote the teaching of indigenous languages. Take, for example, this 1711 decree addressed to the Real Audiencia in Manila to support the Augustinian friars who were teaching Tagalog, Kapampangan, Ilocano, and Bisaya. We also have this other decree from 1870 for the founding of an Instituto Filipino where the Tagalog and Bisaya languages were to be taught. There were also decrees to promote the teaching of Spanish, such as the one from the Real Audiencia in 1689 and another one from the Archdiocese of Manila in 1765. Of course, we have to acknowledge that it's one thing to publish a decree, and it's another thing to implement it on the ground. As with other cases in the Spanish Philippines, the successful implementation of a decree depended on how willingly the colonial bureaucracy responded to it and what sort of opposition it met along the way. Which brings us to the controversy that hounded the establishment of the Catedra, or professorial chair of the Tagalog language at the Universidad Central de Madrid. Although perhaps unremarkable for us today, this controversy sparked great interest in Filipino intellectual circles in the late 19th century, so much so that Rizal himself inserted it as a simile in the third chapter of the Noli Me Tangere. Other authors, such as Wenceslao Retana and Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, also referenced this controversy in their writings. The establishment of the Tagalog Catedra at the Universidad Central was part of the wider social reforms that Spain wanted to introduce in its remaining colonies during the tumultuous period in its history called the Sexenio Democrático, or the Six Democratic Years. About 3 decades before the collapse of its empire, Spain was no longer the superpower it once was, having lost most of its possessions in America at the beginning of the 19th century. It was also still reeling from the aftermath of the revolution dubbed as La Gloriosa. It was this revolution that deposed Queen Isabella II in 1868 and paved the way for the promulgation of a liberal constitution a year after. The Franco-Prussian War broke out in July of 1870. The Third French Republic came to power in September after Napoleon III of France was defeated. Rome was annexed from the Papal States and became the capital of a unified Italy in October of that year. Amid the volatile geopolitical situation around the world, Spain saw the need to introduce reforms to secure the Philippines as a matter of strategy. One of the reforms was to establish a merit-based civil service system that would be manned by Spaniards who would pass a competitive exam in Madrid, and the exam would cover topics in the history, culture, politics of Asia and the Pacific. One of the sections of this competitive exam was the Tagalog language. This was why a Tagalog Catedra had to be created specifically in Madrid. Given that the civil service exam would have a section on the applicant's aptitude in Tagalog, the Spanish government should ensure that formal training in the language could be obtained in the capital city. The 1845 Plan Pidal had centralized higher education in Madrid in such a way that its Universidad Central was the only institution in Spain where competitive exams for public positions could be taken. Choosing Tagalog as the language of the Catedra was also a logistical move. Even though it was second only to Bisaya in terms of number of speakers around this time, Tagalog was the primary language of Manila, the capital of the islands where most colonial institutions converged. The decree creating the Catedra with an annual endowment of 4,000 pesetas was issued on the 2nd of October, 1870. Together with it were created 2 other professorial chairs, one in the history of the Dutch possessions in Asia and Oceania, and another one in Philippine history and civilization. The search committee was headed by Fernando de Castro, rector of the Universidad Central, and he was joined by liberal academics Emilio Castelar, Nicolas Salmeron, and Jose Moreno Nieto, as well as bureaucrats who were once assigned in the Philippines. Salmeron and Castelar, of course, went on to become presidents of the First Spanish Republic. 6 applicants vied for the professorial chair. 2 of them were ilustrados living in Madrid. The first was a 22-year-old Rafael Enriquez, a graduate of the UST. And the second was the 38-year-old Gregorio Abreu. The other 4 applicants were Spaniards. Joaquin de Coria, a 56-year-old Franciscan missionary. Victor Camacho Lorenzo, a priest and canon lawyer. Francisco Arriaga, a 31-year-old Franciscan who was forced to leave the order earlier that year. We will meet him again later. And Mariano Pardo, also a Franciscan. The profiles of the applicants and the members of the search committee give us an idea of the configuration of higher education in the Spanish Empire. For starters, it was an entirely masculine affair. Spanish universities had a history of female academics dating to as far back as the 15th century, yet higher education before the 20th century was dominated by men. It is also important to underscore that the 4 Spaniards who applied for the position were priests. Foreign language teaching had long been the domain of the clergy, who by virtue of their spiritual ministry were tasked to study the many languages of the archipelago. The profiles of the applicants also show that there was no academic specialism in language teaching. Language teaching was ancillary to other scholarly pursuits like theology, philosophy, and civil law. In the absence of a specialized degree for learning and teaching a language, competency was proven through birth or extended residence in a country where it was spoken. The ability of using Tagalog, or perhaps more precisely of writing it, was conflated with the ability to teach it. At a time when the prevailing approach to language teaching was the grammar translation method, emphasis was placed on the applicant's knowledge in writing and translating grammatical sentences, and not on developing the interrelated skills of reading, writing, speaking, and listening that would actually allow students to communicate effectively. This was quite evident in the set of questions the applicants had to answer, both orally and in writing, as part of the selection process. All the topics centered on the applicant's knowledge of comparative philology, such as the origins of Philippine languages, the structures of the Tagalog verbs, a contrastive analysis between the Spanish copula and its counterparts in Tagalog, or the compositional features of a Tagalog corrido. There was no specific test for methodologies. After 3 grueling days of exams and interviews, the search committee finally voted to give the chair to the 31-year-old ex-Franciscan Francisco Arriaga. The story could have ended here, actually, if it weren't for the veto that Sigismundo Moret exercised to deny Arriaga and instead appoint the 56-year-old Joaquin de Coria as his replacement. Moret invoked a clause in the selection criteria to justify his decision. The search committee ought to have examined the applicant's profile first. I will not have the time to talk about the profiles of Arriaga and Coria in detail today, but the long and short of it is that Arriaga was identified with a growing nationalist movement in the Philippines. He was a vocal critic of the colonial church and even demanded that the Franciscan order be reformed to subject it more firmly to the authority of the diocesan bishop. This, of course, played into the controversy between the Regulares, of which Arriaga was a member, and the Seculares, whom Arriaga seemed to support. This, Arriaga maintained in hindsight, was the reason he was denied the Catedra. So disenchanted was Arriaga with the results that he described himself as a victim of theocracy in the Spanish Philippines, in this pamphlet he published after the search. Arriaga was also involved in a confrontation in his parish in Morong, in which he sided with the native Gobernadorcillo instead of the Spanish military commander of the area. The records did not give us the details of the confrontation, but whatever happened in Morong so scandalized the colonial authorities that Arriaga was brought to Manila, removed from the Franciscan order, imprisoned for 3 months, and then ordered to return to Spain without being able to bring any of his property or life savings. Joaquin de Coria was the exact opposite. He was one of the stalwarts of the Franciscan order in the Philippines. Between his ordination in the Philippines in 1830 and his return to Spain in 1866, he managed to minister in Binondo in Manila, Paquil, Magdalena in Pagsanjan in Laguna, Obando in Bulacan, and Tayabas in present-day Quezon. He returned to Spain as a procurator of the Franciscan order and founded the Franciscan College in Consuegra in the province of Toledo. And there's another Noli Me Tangere connection here. It has been suggested that Coria may well have been the inspiration for Padre Damaso, the iconic villain of Rizal's first novel. A prolific commentator who opposed any plans to reform the clergy, Coria made a name for himself for writing a multi-part opinion piece entitled Los Frailes de Filipinas for the Spanish magazine Altar y Trono. He used this essay to accuse the native clergy of promoting anti-Spanish sentiments, claiming that, quote, 35 years on the islands give us the right to think that we know what is happening there, end of quote. Now, if we remember our Noli Me Tangere, we know that Padre Damaso said something similar in chapter 1. On the 22nd of April, 1871, Fray Joaquin de Coria delivered his inaugural address as the first holder of the Catedra of Tagalog at the Universidad Central of Madrid. He spoke about the fundamental role of language in bringing civilizations, arguing that all wealth, industries, and artistic expression would not have any philosophical value if it weren't for language. He asserted, too, that Philippine civilization is due largely and exclusively to the religious orders, a theme he had defended repeatedly in previous writings. He devoted the second half of his speech to poetry, which, according to him, was the clearest indication that a people had reached the splendor of civilization. Of course, that is a very problematic proposition. He went on to publish a book, the Nueva Gramatica Tagalog Teorico-Practica in 1872, one of the last missionary grammars of Tagalog, which many of us may know because of its lengthy discussion of Tagalog poetry. Coria's grammar would be the only scholarly output following his professorial appointment. The Franciscans of Castile vehemently opposed the idea of teaching any Philippine language to Spaniards, and thus, as with Francisco Arriaga, decided to remove Coria from their ranks. Finally, within the year of the publication of Coria's grammar, we read in a report that the priest passed away with neither assistance nor resources coming from the Franciscans. As for Francisco Arriaga, the candidate who topped the search, he began dabbling more and more into journalism, writing pieces for radical publications in Madrid on the abuses perpetrated by Spaniards in the Philippines. A year and a half later, he made his way to Cuba. He soon orchestrated a mutiny in the city of Matanzas, where he was a parochial vicar and even converted to Protestantism for a time. In November 1889, he wrote several strongly worded open letters to the Bishop of Havana to denounce the prelate's decision to imprison him in the Convento de la Merced. Arriaga was said to have died in an unknown location in Mexico in 1909. The short Catedra, the Tagalog Catedra, had a short and almost non-productive existence. Yet it encapsulated the many challenges of keeping the remnants of the Imperial project between Spain and its colonies afloat. Spain's liberalist aspirations, which made the creation of the Catedra in Madrid possible, clashed with local ecclesiastical rivalries in Manila. The controversial search process of the Catedra likewise revealed the contradictions of wanting to institute reforms, while at the same time protecting institutions and interests that made such reforms an imperative in the first place. On a very personal note, given that this is perhaps the only conference paper in this conference representing the history of linguistics in the Philippines, it may be worth advocating for more studies to be written in this field. While some quarters may view translation and language teaching as secondary to bigger social institutions and movements, I hope I have shown somehow that they are equally useful in understanding the complex relationship between the Philippines and Spain. Muchas gracias. Many thanks. Maraming salamat po.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Marlon, for your presentation. Okay, and with that, we'd like to call on Dr. Owen to provide his comments for the panel. Dr. Owen, are you ready? Hello? Ah, hello?
Um,
Unmuting now, okay?
Okay. Oh,
Can you
sorry.
hear?
Sorry, Marlon, can you please turn off your screen sharing?
Okay.
Okay, thanks. So now we have Dr. Owen to provide his commentary on the panel's papers.
Okay. Okay, let me begin by thanking all of the panelists. I think that was they were excellent. They also everybody stuck to the time. Thanks also to our moderator, which means that we actually have a few minutes to think about what they said. I'm going to start by dealing with the first two papers together, both of them happen to be on 17th century Laguna. It's relatively unusual to have two papers covering so close the same place and time, but actually in some ways it's an advantage rather than winding up where we say, oh yes, this model works for this province in the 17th century, but another model works for the different province in the 19th century, and so what the hell do we know? This way, at least we're talking about the same thing. First, I'd like to thank both Grace and Hobie for their dogged empiricism, which is generally a thankless enterprise in research. It's my experience that you spend 6 months painstakingly piecing together the data for a single table, and all your readers treat it as if you just looked it up on the internet in 2 minutes. So thank you for this thankless task for both Grace and Hobie for giving us some actual facts. These papers flesh out our vague assumptions about municipal and provincial offices in the early Spanish period. Hobie shows, at least to my dissatisfaction, although he correctly points out it is not dispositively proven, that Filipino families apparently did not attempt to monopolize local offices in San Pablo, as they did elsewhere in the Philippines right up to the present. Both papers show that some local leaders did, however, move from office to office over the course of a lifetime, with Grace in particular pointing out military officialdom as a parallel path to influence. What is left for us, for all of us, not just for the two presenters, is Hobie's question: why did Filipinos seek or not seek public office, especially in the 17th century? And looking at this from a Filipino perspective, not from the perspective of that of the Spaniards who designed the system, which for these purposes we can set aside. What were the advantages and disadvantages of office holding? And I have listed a few. Civic duty, we'd probably right to be skeptical about that, just as we are of patriotic politicians today. I'm only out here to serve the Philippine people, sure, or the American people, same thing. Defending their people in the case of military officers, maybe, but we have little evidence that I have seen that these settlements, as opposed to Spanish authority in general, were directly threatened. Christian charity and a civilizing mission, the Spanish may have, as Grace indicates, awarded Filipinos encomiendas so that they could gather the scattered people in the mountains and civilize them. But my presumption is that the encomenderos were not necessarily so altruistic as this, that they expected to get something out of the arrangement. What about prestige? The right to be called Don, the right to carry the baston, the right to sit in the best pews in the parish church, whatever. Surely that counted for something. But we may also wonder, at least I do, whether such prestige ended with the term of office, the end of a term of office. My guess, based on later evidence from Bicol, is that it did not. Once you were a capitan, you got called that, and you were treated like a principal for the rest of your life, long after you had passed on your official post to your successor. And this may help explain why we have this revolving door. You hold office for a couple of years, everyone recognizes you as a principal or a capitan, and thereafter you can step down and you still got the prestige. So we're down to the basics of political life, almost every place, wealth and power, which tend to go together. Now we're getting somewhere. In practical terms, it did cost money to hold office, the media annata, from which these data are largely drawn. But supposedly, I stress supposedly, that was offset by the profits of such an office. In fact, the media annata was literally supposed to be half a year's salary. So you had the whole salary and then half of it you kicked back to the government. We don't know, as Grace points out, whether this salary was actually paid or collected or by whom or so forth, but that's an important factor. If the media annata was a straight extraction from the officers, then that's one thing. If it was just a paying back in advance of money that they were expected to collect later as their salary, that's a different thing. Obviously, exemptions from tributes and servicios, very, very big, especially in a society where labor was more important than actual currency in the economic life of the village. Exemption for themselves, exemption for their friends. Power, power to force others to serve, or power to grant them exemptions, perhaps by appointments as minor officials in return for favors. Potentially of great value. I'm reminded of an old saying about the President of the United States that he has the power to appoint and disappoint members of his cabinet. Judicial authority over local disputes, which could be a huge benefit, and this was expressly what the principales were being given by Spain, as Abisai points out in his paper. So a lot of potential advantages. Against these potential gains, we may imagine the losses Filipinos might have perceived, not just of time and effort, it's a drag being, doing all the paperwork or whatever, but especially, as has been pointed out, the responsibility for unmet obligations by the community under his command. Tax is not remitted, service is not performed, it falls back on the gobernadorcillo or whoever it might be to make up the shortfalls. What we lack here, at least I haven't seen it in these papers, I haven't seen it any place to be fair, is an understanding of the enforcement of these laws, of these rules and regulations, not just what was written about who was responsible for what, but what was actually collected, who actually had to pay, who actually went to jail if they couldn't pay. What were the actual risks of office holding as opposed to the potential rewards? So we're left back where we were, not knowing for sure. Now, Hobie suggests that a weak parish priest, friar, such as he finds in San Pablo, may have made office holding less attractive. That's possible, but that would appear to be the opposite of what I have seen in Bicol a century or two later, where it looks as if the weaker the clerical presence, the stronger the principalia. Presumably the more attractive office holding was. Where you have a tough-minded Spanish friar, the principales, not so happy about that. Where you have a more absent or compliant Filipino secular priest, well, it was a good time to be a principal. And this is also implied in the fact that the reports of elites avoiding office tend to come mostly from the area around Manila, which happens to be the area where the clerical presence is strongest, generally, in a very, very, very broad generalization here. I don't know any way of investigating this topic directly, but it's certainly a question that should entertain all of us, not just the two presenters here. It's worthwhile to take another look at something else Hobie mentions, peasants moving from one pueblo to another. Which he attributes in this case to presence of animism, strength or weakness of priests, labor obligations. Let's stop for the moment to ignore the particular reasons for that, but look at it as a remarkable example of Filipino autonomy. Voting with their feet is what they called it in the Cold War era of Vietnam and places like that. These are Christian Filipinos who defy the ordinance that tell them always to remain in their own pueblo except with permission, and they simply move away. But they're not going up to the hills as remontados, rejecting Christianity and rejecting Spanish authority. They're moving to another Hispanized Christian community a few miles away that simply suits them better, and they're getting away with it. Now, we can't know the rights and wrongs of such transfers, but the fact that they occurred, and in 18th century Bicol, especially in the district we now call Partido, they were happening all the time, and people were complaining about them all the time. You know, the taxpayers here, the tributos here have moved over to the next town and stop them, somebody bring them back. This suggests that Spanish control over Filipino population movement was much less strict in practice than it was on paper. Grace, meanwhile, is on a different track, pointing out the importance of military offices as a complementary path to power and prestige for principales. That is very interesting, and particularly for the 17th century. What I'd like to know, beyond the scope of what she had, is whether it is more true of the 17th century, when Spanish rule was still somewhat precarious and the Dutch and the Chinese and everybody seemed to be attacking, as opposed to a century or two or three later, when the military threat may have declined. Although I did point out to Grace, there is a wonderful example in 1818, early 19th century, of an 80-year-old Bicolano commanding local naval forces who throw back the Moro invaders in a famous Battle of Tabogon Bay, which makes him a great local hero. It also raises a question about whether military leadership actually differed from office holding, civil office holding. Now, in the pre-Spanish period, we assume that most datus were in fact actual military combat leaders. That was part of their job description. By the 17th century, not so much. These people have, as far as I know, no particular military training, no particularly military experience. What they're doing is basically organizing labor, much as they would in their roles at gobernadorcillos or something like that. But I'm wondering whether there's a transition point here. At what point people who are actually good at military things get military offices, and to what extent it's just one other way of mobilizing Filipino labor for the government. Okay, enough about that for the moment. Two papers on Spanish aims. Far larger gap between the topics, no overlap really at all, but they have some similarities. First, both of them stress Spanish good intentions as against the monolithic bad image of Spanish colonialism, we often say. That's good. And both also illustrate nuanced splits within the Spanish hierarchies, not just conservatives against liberals, with which, if you've studied 19th century Philippines, you have some nodding acquaintance, but even among liberals. I was struck by the fact that Indigenist hero Martin de Rada, who spoke out against the encomiendas, essentially abandons further reform efforts because he wants to convert China. And in the chair, liberal Spanish overseas minister sabotages the too radical winner of the competition for the chair of Tagalog at the Universidad Central de Madrid for, again, political reasons of his own. But within the so-called liberal Spanish establishment, there are divisions, as you would expect if you were thinking that, yeah, we're actually dealing with real people here, not just with stereotypes. They also echo each other in a very important way, in that essentially both of the reformist efforts that they depict fail. Spain does indeed establish a nominal República de Yndios in the Philippines, but nobody knows about it, as Abisai himself points out, because it was all really kind of meaningless. It winds up establishing or reinforcing elite domination at the local level, rather than any more Republican value, whatever that means. And the 19th century chair in Tagalog at a Spanish university is also forgotten. I have to admit, I'd never heard of it myself, because it is of little consequence. Soon abandoned, its sole professor dismissed and disgraced. Now, there are various specific reasons for these failures, and both Marlon and Abisai have gone through them ably. From a Filipino perspective, I would suggest that these look like merely variants on a recurrent theme in Philippine history: Spanish intentions as formulated in Madrid, coming to naught when confronted with the reality of the Philippines. Now, this may be seen as hypocrisy or as meaningless verbal formulations. Did any Filipino ever really understand or take seriously the protocol of pacification of Legazpi? I have my doubts. Or simply incompetence. But in any event, the outcome is the same. The best of Spanish aims just don't happen. The king says many times, teach the Filipinos to speak Spanish, and 3 centuries later, Philippines is still not a Spanish-speaking country, and some people on the internet still wonder about that. I reminded of a dictum I learned when I was first studying the Spanish Philippines, supposedly pronounced by governors in Manila responding to directives from Madrid. Obedezco, pero no cumplo. I obey, but I do not comply. I am not in any way disputing your authority, but for good and complicated reasons, which I will list, what you ordered is not in fact what is going to happen. Sorry about that. And that seems to me what these wind up being further examples of. Now, with regard to some of the specific questions, with regard to Abisai's paper, one key question has to do with the concept of the pueblo, which is central to his explanation for why the Republica of Yndios, de Yndios failed in the Philippines. There were, in fact, pueblos in the Philippines, created as in Mexico by forced resettlement of natives, reducción, into more centralized communities. In fact, the first two papers are all about such pueblos. So I need to know more. I think we need to know more about the difference between the colonies. Were Mexican pueblos just that much more densely populated? I don't know. Or they were earlier, but our Philippine pueblo formation so late that they sort of missed the window of opportunity of actually following the Mexican model. Or is it simply the fact that there were, as Abisai says in a section of his paper that unfortunately for my reason, he had to omit for purposes of time here, in Mexico, there were pre-Hispanic social institutions that could be converted into cabildos, into local councils that countered the weight of the principales. And there were no such institutions in the Philippines, so the datus were just given straight power with nothing to weigh them out. This is a critical point because the presence or absence of cabildos does seem to me to potentially have a lot to do with the differences in political development over the next several centuries. And Marlon's paper deals with very different issues several centuries later, and may seem relatively trivial compared with the whole question of the formation and early entrenchment of Filipino elites dealt with in the earlier papers. After all, even had the proposal for the Catedra sailed through gloriously as planned, there had been and Arriaga, the rebel radical, had been named to the chair of the Tagalog at the Universidad Central de Madrid, what difference would it have made? I don't know. Might have conceivably tipped some of the propagandists into a less radical direction and then thus somehow postpone the revolution, but that's idle speculation. But if you look at what Marlon does uncover, both the reality of Spanish liberalism and the splits within it, it suggests what a weak reed the propagandists were leaning on in their hope for some kind of a negotiated arrangement with Spain that would be fair to both parties. That if this is the best Spain has to offer by way of arrangement, by way of negotiation, by way of compromise, maybe compromise is not possible, which is eventually what Bonifacio and others decided. Another possible insight from this paper, and I'm going to close with this, is to look for hints as to what Filipinos at the time thought of this whole proposition, which Marlon does address. I'm impressed, actually, by the fact that two Filipinos had the audacity, the hubris, the chutzpah, to apply for the Catedra, even though they didn't get it, and probably wouldn't have, even if their credentials had been stronger. It bespeaks to me a growing rise of confidence within Philippine society, not just from the well-known propagandists, but the Filipinos thinking they are capable of dealing on equal terms with the Spaniards, even in Spain itself. Good for them, say I. As for how much weight we should place on the awareness that Jose Rizal and Father Burgos had of these men and these events, I'm not sure about that, although I do like the idea of Father Correa as the model for Father Damaso. I suspect that Rizal and Burgos and so forth saw what was happening to the extent they even thought about it in much the same terms suggested above. Too little, too late, another Spanish well-intentioned venture doomed to failure and not worth getting excited about. But that's important too. History is not only about the winners and the big people who make the big, it's also about the little people and what they were concerned about and what they tried to do and whether they failed or not. And with that, I will conclude and turn it over to anybody else who has questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Owen, for your comments and your insights on our presenters' papers. All right, so with that, I'd like to open the floor to any and all questions, either from our Zoom participants here or from our YouTube audience. So simply click on the raise hand button and ask your question either verbally or by utilizing the group chat in the chat box. Okay, so that said, does anyone have any questions? How about from YouTube? Does anyone on YouTube have a question for our panelists or any comments? Right, so while we're waiting for questions, I have a question for Dr. Concepcion. So, Dr. Concepcion, you mentioned earlier that the military and the civil military kind of had similar structures. So, why do you think, what explanation can you think of for that?
Sorry, you said that. Um, can you repeat the question about the
Okay.
similarity in structure?
Okay, yeah. So, why do you think the military and the civil authority structures, why do you think they had similar, why were they similar in structure for you?
Oh, I think what I compared. Okay, first I showed the organogram of the Spanish military in the peninsula, and I highlighted the military posts that were more or less exported to the Philippines. And then next, projected, I flashed the image of the list of military posts at provincial level and the military posts at Pueblo level. So I just compared military posts in both Pueblo and provincial level, but I didn't compare it to the civil positions. But what I said was sometimes those people who held military posts also held civil positions at one time or another in their lives. Now, I'm not sure. I think I found one Maestre de Campo who became a gobernadorcillo, and he still had the title Maestre de Campo. So that now leads to a comment on Norman's observation, or question about military post holding as similar to civil post holding. I really don't know. That still requires research, but what I see is the natives seem to be moving from one position to another without any problem. Well, of course, that comment is problematic because I only looked at the entries of Media Anata, which did not probe native motivations. But yeah, you can see mobility among the natives as far as holding military and civil posts is concerned. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Jillian. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for answering my question. Yeah. Okay. And I see I see that all right, we have a question
All
in
right,
the chat
Dr.
box.
Bolino. Yeah.
Yes. So this is for Dr. Grace and for Hobie. Are municipal elites that get political positions also immune from punishment for corruption or minor crimes, since, as Dr. Owen states, they carry the prestige and title for life?
Do you want to answer first, Hobie? Or
Um, that's a good question. And hi, Mandu. I have as far as policy, I have not yet seen policy that says such. As far as actual cases, because we're dealing with an early period, um, I have also not seen cases. In the media anata, there are some criminal cases that show up, but what you have is an indulto for those cases, and there were very few. Um, so for now, the answer is I'm not sure. How about you, Chris?
Okay. Hi, Ma'am Lou, and thank you for the question. Okay, same as Hobie, not sure. But I saw an account of a Franciscan who wrote about the elections of the Gobernadorcillo in the 1600s. And he commented that there was a lot of corruption because there were flying voters. But if they were penalized for that sort of crime, I have no way of knowing at this point. Yeah, I think Hobie wants to say something.
Okay. I was just thinking that as far as benefits of the position, in the age when it was autonomous datus, they so okay, because I'm thinking in the 1600s. Okay, in the 1600s now, in their municipal officials, a lot of the benefits comes from turning what should be public funds towards the private resources of the local leader, and this is corruption, right? Um, but you go back a little bit, a century, and you have the datu, and these things would be within his capacity as datu. So in that transition from datu to Gobernadorcillo, I I wonder how long it would take for him to realize that, oh wait, this is no longer permitted, and whether the colonial officials began to how much they would begin to punish it, knowing that just a few decades earlier it was what was public was essentially private.
Yeah, can I add to that?
Sure.
Yeah. And then speaking of, well, he spoke of that too, who became Gobernadorcillo, and the Gobernadorcillo who became encomendero. Now that complicates the question because the encomendero, in theory, should be working for the benefit of those who were encomendados, the group of natives who were entrusted to him. And since he, in theory, was taking care of that group of natives for their Christianization, for their welfare, he had the right to collect tribute. And a fraction of that tribute was used for his upkeep. And so, how much was that punishable, and how much of it became a criminal offense? We don't really know. Yeah. So there's a lot of gray areas here that we still need to look into.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for answering. Thank you so much for answering the question, Dr. Concepcion and Hobie. Okay, but unfortunately we're all out of time. So yeah, we'll be taking a short break before the second keynote address by Father Rene Haveliana at 10:15. Right. So with this, I'd like to thank all of our presenters and Dr. Norman Owen as well. Thank you for your presentations and for your insights this day. Yes, so thank you so much, and please do join us for the keynote speaker, sorry, for the keynote speech at
And yeah.
10:15 today. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank
See you
you.
again
Thank
later.
you.
Julian.